Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jamie Miller at Freddie Mac. Thank you for joining us today for our third exchange webinar. We really appreciate everybody's participation. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you could mute your phones if you're not speaking, that would be great. We want to make sure everybody can hear. We are recording this session, and we will plan to post it to the website along with the slides. So you can look for those. We'll take questions at the end, but if we run out of time and we don't get to your question, please do submit your questions to us at Freddie Mac at single_security@freddiemac.com, or you can send questions also to TradeWeb at umbs@tradeweb.com. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Pock to get us kicked off here today. Barbara?
Okay, thank you, Jamie. So this is Barbara Pock. I will spend a few minutes talking about the actual single security initiative and the features that we are trying to design. But we are going to spend most of our time this hour, and the webinar is going to be on Exchange. There's a lot of details associated with the path that we have designed. So the single security effort has been started by FHFA, our regulator, in 2014 via the scorecard that they passed to us, both Freddie and Fannie. And so the objective of the effort is really to merge two agency TBA markets into one, okay? And the timing, I think we're at the final stretches here. June 3rd of 2019 is the timing of when the new UMBS will settle, and we're going to start to issue those new securities together, Fannie and Freddie, okay? So if you look at page 2, that gives you just a general overview of what the single security looks like. It is the new sort of features is going to be very similar to Fannie's current MBS. We are, if you could think of it as Freddie Mac jumping into Fannie's security, because they do have more liquid security. But essentially, though, we are going to produce a same security called UMBS. So instead of Gold PC or MBS for Fannie, we are relabeling for that security to be called Uniform Mortgage-Backed Security. And then level 2 also is going to get rebranded. You might be familiar with Giants or Megas. For the new resecuritization, would be called Supers. Okay. What's going to be a little different in this new world, of course, is the fact that we are going to have commingling of collateral at the second level resecuritization. So we currently do not allow that in our Supers and Megas in today's world, but when we move into the new world of UMBS, that will be allowed, okay? But it's not a merge of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae as a legal entity. So it will be absolutely issued and guaranteed separately.
Representative will assist you shortly.
Okay. If you don't mind, if you could just mute your phone. I don't know if somebody has put us on hold. So the alignment, of course, is the fact that we are moving to be very similar to Fannie's MBS. We are going to take and adopt a lot of the nomenclatures of Fannie's MBS. So we're not changing that. So we're going to, for example, we're going to go ahead and adopt the 55-day payment delay. We're also going to adopt Fannie's prefixes and netting and clearing. We're going to also just leverage the 01F or FICC. But since disclosure, Freddie's a little better with that one. So we are also aligning on the format of the disclosures. Freddie's already using that format as of August of last year, and Fannie will adopt to that new format starting in June. Okay, like I said, from a timing perspective, June 3rd is when we will go live with the new UMBS. But we predict that forward trade is going to be for that 30, 60, or 90 days ahead of that. So we are thinking probably sometime in March of 2019, you'll start to see the forward trading for the UMBS would start. So for today's main topic, which is exchange, Freddie Mac will begin to start the exchange program starting in May of 2019. Okay. Let me go ahead and then flip to next page, which is page 3. which is the overall exchange program. And so we are making this program an optional program for the holders. So Fannie, if you hold Fannie security, you do not need to go through exchange. It's just for if you are holding 45-day fixed rate product, you could actually go ahead and exchange it to UMBS or supers. We are not making it mandatory, as well as we're actually keeping this option open for a foreseeable future, okay? And because we're aligning with Fannie on the payment delay, so we're moving from paying our investors from 15th to the 25th of the month, we're going to actually compensate for that 10 days of lost float, okay? So because, again, this is a new program for, Freddie Mac to be able to jump into the new UMBS, there are going to be several new disclosures that we will be producing as part of the exchange programs. So we have listed those on page 3, okay? So we want to go through the details. There are a couple of options, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Jamie to walk us through those key options that you, as an investor, would have.
Thanks, Barbara. All right, so we are going to be offering 2 different exchange paths. In the process of working with the market over the last 6 months, we heard clearly that there are some different needs out there. So we have 2 paths that have some slightly different features depending on what you're looking for, what your needs are, and we'll go through those in much more detail. But just at a high level, the 2 paths are a dealer-facilitated exchange where you would work with your dealer, as you might do today if you execute Giants, to request an exchange. The other path that we will be offering is a direct to Freddie Mac exchange via TradeWeb. So TradeWeb is going to facilitate the front end of the exchange process. So if you are accustomed to using TradeWeb, or if you would like to use TradeWeb, this is another option for you. I would say the biggest difference in the 2 paths is the payment aspect. So in the dealer facilitated exchange, that is going to be a DVP delivery to the dealer. So the investor and the dealer would have monies flowing and the securities to execute the exchange. Whereas with the Freddie path, that is going to be a free of payment exchange. Generally speaking, with the dealer path, it's really just to facilitate the trade. So the dealer will buy your 45-day securities from you, come to Freddie, get your 55-day new UMBS backed by your same 45-day collateral, and then sell that back to you. And what most dealers have said they're going to do is net out the float compensation. So that 10 days delay difference between the 45-day security and the 55-day security, Freddie Mac will be making payments for that. But in the dealer path, once we send the cash to the dealer, most dealers have said they'll just net it out of the price that the securities will be bought back by the investor. Whereas in the Freddie path, Freddie is obviously going to be working directly with investors. So your securities will be delivered to us. There will be no price associated with that from Freddie's perspective. We're not buying the securities from you. And then we will exchange your 45-day for 55-day securities, again, backed by the same collateral, and also send back a separate cash wire for the float compensation. But we'll get into much more detail on that in a few minutes. I really want to spend some time turning to page 5, just starting to walk everybody through the exchange process. And we've kind of set this presentation up to walk through the various steps. So the first, obviously, is your preparation. Not just when you're ready to exchange, going to the dealer or going into TradeWeb and executing the exchange, but all the things you need to do to get it set up in advance. And we can't stress enough that we want people to get started as soon as possible. This is not an overnight process to get ready for exchange. So you need to start thinking about this now. The next part is the actual transaction entry. So when you've determined what path you're going to use and done all the setup, then you can go through your chosen path, either through the dealer or through TradeWeb. Then there's the settlement of the transaction, and that will either be via the dealer or via Freddie Mac. And then obviously the accounting and tax reporting for each of the exchanges, and everybody has some different nuances there, so we'll walk through that as well. All right, so let's talk about exchange preparation. So as I mentioned, the first thing you want to think about is what your exchange strategy is. Do you hold exchange eligible QSIPs? Freddie Mac has just completed our initial mirror issuance. So we've issued to ourselves all the 55-day mirror securities that mirror the 45-day eligible gold PCs and giants that are outstanding right now. And we'll continue that process up until the time we go live with single security. So as we issue new golds, we'll issue mirrors to correspond to those. You can go out to our website, go into our cumulative exchange activity report, and pull up the entire list of all the securities that are eligible to be exchanged, as well as their corresponding mirrors and their QSIPs. So you can go ahead and start planning for what you want to do there. We also will be offering discounted giants. So if you need to do some portfolio consolidation, if you've got small pieces of securities and you want to make them into larger securities before you go through the exchange to help with the administrative burden, we are offering discounted giants up until the time the exchange opens. There's just a $2,500 administrative fee for those giants. And there is a minimum giant size, as always, of $1 million. So that's kind of looking at your own portfolio. Then you need to think about what exchange path you want to use. So some of the things you might want to think of are, do you have complex sub-account structures? If you have lots of clients and sub-accounts that you work with, the TradeWeb path may be an easier way for you to enter that information and track it back into your funds. You need to also think about your OMS system and how you get trades into and out of that system, and how much straight-through processing you want to do versus a manual process. If you're not going to be doing a lot of exchanges, if your exchanges are not particularly complex, it might be easier just to go through your dealer, through the existing relationship and setup that you already have. So those are some of the things to think about. But as I said, we're really encouraging everybody to think about it now, to talk to your custodians, talk to your dealer and or TradeWeb and your vendors to figure out how the process is going to work and what particular requirements they're going to have. One other thing that we want to remind people of is it's going to be much easier for you to exchange, and we want you to avoid fails, if you have the collateral in hand. So if you have existing lending agreements or repo agreements through your custodian, you want to make sure your securities are back in your possession, in their possession on your behalf, before you submit an exchange request. That's very important. One other thing that we are going to be posting to help you prepare for exchanges is going to be a float compensation calculator. So we'll be publishing a couple of things, actually, an indicative price grid, and then we're actually going to have a calculator where you'll be able to enter your QSIPs and determine what the float compensation would be on a given day. Obviously, this is not live pricing because we haven't gone live with exchange, but we'll be updating that on a fairly regular basis. So you'll get a sense of what you might receive if you were to do an exchange today, as well as any pay-ups that are associated with particular cohorts. And that information will also eventually be built into TradeWeb. So one of the things that you can do when you're ready to exchange is actually enter your QSIPs in advance, determine your float compensation. That can be exported to an Excel spreadsheet and used to upload or send a request to your dealer or TradeWeb. So that's another way to use that tool. So look for that later this quarter. All right, so on page 8, I wanted to talk a little bit more about how you might want to choose which path to use. So in the dealer path, your dealer is your counterparty, and that's something that most of you should be accustomed to. In the direct to Freddie path, though, Freddie Mac is going to be your counterparty, and that's something new. So you need to think about what your counterparty setup process is. Freddie Mac is developing a small packet of materials that we can share to kind of satisfy your counterparty setup needs. But that is something that you'll need to do in advance, is get us set up as your counterparty. Another thing to think about is if you're a current TradeWeb user, exchange via TradeWeb is not limited to current TradeWeb customers. Even if you don't use TradeWeb for any other transactions, you can still use them for exchanges. So you'll just need to go through a customer setup process. Delivery, I mentioned this before, in the dealer path, that will be a DVP transaction. So you need to think about exchange prices. Some investors have expressed concern about having to book at a market price, but that is something that the dealers have said they must do. So if that's not a concern for you, the dealer path could be good. Whereas in the Freddie path, it's free of payment. So there's no price associated with the transaction that Freddie Mac is posting. If you do need to have a price in your system, though, you can enter a price that TradeWeb can echo back to you in the process of going through the transaction. And TradeWeb will talk about that a little bit later. Another thing to think about for 40 Act funds is how you can retain control of your holdings and which path is going to be better in terms of regulations that you need to meet. Float compensation, again, I mentioned this before. Most of the dealers have said they're going to net the float compensation payment, which is, again, a one-time payment, out of the transaction. So will your accounting and tax systems be able to track that notional price for the float compensation, because you won't actually have a wire for that. In the Freddie path, you are going to be receiving a separate cash wire that you may need to track through your accounting and tax processes. Exchange booking, there are some differences here. Through the dealer path, dealers can book exchanges up to a month in advance of the current month. So if you need to have certainty about your exchange far in advance, you may want to consider the dealer path. Through the TradeWeb path, you can only book exchanges for the current month. Another concern might be the privacy of your holdings. Some investors have said they don't want to expose their portfolio to dealers. They want to keep their holdings private. So that's a consideration. Dealers obviously will be able to see your holdings if you go through the dealer path. Cost. So there is no cost being charged by Freddie Mac for either path. Dealers may determine they will charge a fee for exchanges that would be a separate charge away from the actual price and float compensation that will be part of the transaction. Through the direct to Freddie path, there will be no fee for the first 3 years of this path. TradeWeb may charge transaction fees after the first several years of this exchange path, but there will be no fee from Freddie. Another consideration is your timeline. Right now, only the dealer path is going to be open for the foreseeable future. Our agreement with TradeWeb is that path will be open for 5 years. So obviously that's still a long time in market time to be able to do your exchanges, but again, just something to think about. All right, I'm going to turn to page 9. I want to spend a little time talking about your actual transaction timing and volume. So once you've done all your preparation for exchanges and determined your path, you're ready to do an exchange. You can book an exchange transaction by noon, and if they're booked by noon, it can be settled T+1 if we have that capacity for that day. Any transactions booked after noon can be settled a minimum of T+2. Your securities must be delivered to Freddie Mac by noon Eastern time on settlement day. Right now, the process is built for a capacity of 50,000 exchanges per settlement day. That's across both paths. In all our testing and discussions with the market, we think that's going to be more than enough transaction capacity to be able to do exchanges. We do have some blackout dates for exchange settlements. So the first 5 business days of the month, Reg A and Reg B settlement dates, and the remit collateral delivery day, which is EOM-2, we cannot settle any exchanges. So something to keep in mind. We are going to have a little bit of a transition period for exchange. We think it's important to make sure that everybody across the market can do this with a minimum of disruption. We want to make it an orderly process. So we are going to have a period of about 3 to 6 months when we start, where we will not be at full capacity. So we are going to make the minimum settlement timeline T+2, even though we've built it to support T+1. Again, this is just to get everybody used to the process. So T+2 for that first 3 to 6 months. And we also will limit the daily exchange volume. We'll ramp up to the maximum capacity, and we'll be looking at, the exchange volumes coming in each day. But we aren't going to start out of the gate with 50,000. And we'll see how quickly the market adapts to the exchange. And if we're all working smoothly, the transition period may be on the shorter end of that 3 to 6 months. All right, I'm going to turn it over to MR Stanton, who's going to walk us through some of the critical details in setting up for exchange and sending your transactions in. MR?
All right, thank you, Jamie. So on slide 10, we're going to get into some of the nitty-gritty details here. When we talk about the security wires and how you actually deliver the securities in on settlement day, it's important that you set these things up correctly. As Jamie has mentioned, when these securities come into Freddie Mac, it is a free delivery and free receipt. Now, not to be confusing, if you're an investor, you're going to do DVP with the dealer, but even in the dealer path, the dealer, who's the actual one delivering to Freddie, is going to deliver free. So whoever the end point is that's actually delivering into Freddie, you need to set up a free delivery, free receive. And we do have 2 separate dedicated accounts. I know there's been some confusion about this, but when you're sending in the 45-day security, you're going to send that to Freddie Mac's 2BD7 account, but you'll be receiving the 55-day mirror from Freddie Mac's 2BD5 account. So these needed to be 2 different accounts. It has to do with some Fed setup items with commingling with the new securities. They do have to be separated, so make sure you're aware of those 2 separate accounts for free delivery to Freddie. Then moving on to slide 11, another very, very critical component to make sure that these exchanges settle smoothly is to be able to identify for your custodians that this is an exchange transaction. And so this page on slide 11 is actually a recommendation from the custodian community. They are asking that when you instruct them on the security movement, please, 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 if you're using SWIFT, use these recommended tags, the 20C tag to denote the actual exchange transaction ID that you'll get back in your confirmation when you book the transaction. Note, if you're an investor using the dealer path, you'll need to get that information from the dealer because the dealer will receive a confirmation with this information. And then the 2022F tag, which they just want UMBS as a code word in that tag. And what that's going to allow those custodians to do is to make sure they know that it's an exchange transaction, so they route it appropriately for any downstream processing such as accounting. And then also, particularly important for either path, the 20C tag where that common exchange, or excuse me, that unique exchange transaction ID sits, that is actually what's going to allow them, if you're coming direct to Freddie, to tie the security movement activity to the cash wire that you're going to get back on float comp. And if they're doing any kind of reporting or reconciliation or accounting for you, it's going to be really important to be able to tie all of the different pieces of the transaction together. So using these tags is really, really important. If you're using Swift messaging to instruct your custodians. If you don't use Swift, if you're still faxing instructions, the custodians are asking that you still denote these things in that fax instruction to them because they're still going to need the information. So that's incredibly important. Then moving on to slide 12, again, we're way in the details here. But when you deliver, as I'm sure many of you know, the Federal Reserve actually, the FedWire has limits on the size, both a maximum and a minimum of the size that can be sent through in a single FedWire. And so they've got a 50 million maximum, which I think most people are aware of. And so what Freddie Mac's going to be doing is Freddie Mac will be abiding by the IZITC standards, where if we have an exchange transaction that is greater than 50 million, we will split it into increments of 50 million with the tail piece, whatever is left over. To the extent we can abide by that, we will. Want to make sure that it's clear how this all translates into those transaction IDs and the cash wire. So if you're coming direct to Freddie Mac, you enter a QSIP for exchange, you'll be given one exchange transaction ID, and that will eventually on the back end translate into one cash wire. So let's say in the example here that you submit a QSIP for exchange and the par amount of that QSIP you own is $60 million. What's going to happen is you're going to get one transaction ID for that $60 million, and eventually you're going to get one cash wire for that entire $60 million. But for security delivery purposes, because we have to, because of the FedWire, we're actually going to split that into a $50 million piece and a $10 million piece. And again, that's in keeping with the IZITC standards, so hopefully that is very clear to everyone. I will note, just so that you're aware, and we're happy to talk more in depth about this with anyone who's interested, if you're coming in through the dealer facilitated path, the dealers will have the ability to enter more than one QSIP in a single exchange transaction. Not sure they're going to do that. Some have said that might actually be more confusing in the end, but they will have the capacity to do that. And so just one note to recognize, if you're coming through the dealer path and the dealer enters multiple QSIPs in a single exchange transaction, you will get one transaction ID and one cash wire for that entire transaction, whatever it contains. But the security split will be the same. For any QSIP that's over 50, we'll split it accordingly. Number two there is, this is sort of an edge case, but it's important to note, the exception rather to the $50 million split rule is the FedWire also has a minimum delivery amount of $1,000. So if you put in an exchange, let's say you put in an exchange for $50 million, 500. It looks like I have a typo there. Sorry, I need to adjust my slide there. That first box should say $50 million, 500. If it was a $50 million, $50 million and $500 QSIP that you submitted for exchange, if we split it into 50 million, the tail piece would then be 500, which is actually too small to deliver via the FedWire. And so in that special case, you can see we would actually split it into 49 million and 500 and 1,000, basically decrementing that 50 million block until the tail piece was large enough to deliver. So just want everybody to be aware of that. The reason it's really important is because in order to facilitate the exchange process very quickly, Freddie Mac has set up an auto match capability on that incoming 45-day, which means in this case, we're going to have expect files for $49,500 and $1,000. And if you send in some different split, it's not going to match and it'll end up being decayed. So we just want to make sure everybody is aware that that specific breakdown is going to be really, really important so that your exchange transaction matches and can be completed. Okay? All right. Then we're going to go quickly through, again, kind of drilling down a little bit on the dealer-facilitated path. Some details, and we've already hit on some of them, but just to reinforce. So if you're coming through the dealer, if you're an investor, the dealer is your counterparty, and it's going to be DVP between you and your dealer, but then the dealer is going to turn around and deliver free to Freddie. Obviously, you're going to be interacting with your custodian, instructing the actual delivery. And I'm not sure if we've mentioned yet, whole or partial QSIPs can be exchanged. So, if you're holding part of a QSIP, your exchange decision is completely independent of anybody else who owns any other piece of that QSIP. You make your own decision for the piece that you own. We've mentioned the capacity of 50,000 exchanges per day across both paths. That capacity is going to be viewable to the dealer in Dealer Direct. So if you're coming through the dealer path, the dealer is going to be able to go in and look at a calendar. So if you're exchanging via the dealer and you say, hey, I'd like to exchange and settle next Thursday, the dealer will be able to log into Dealer Direct and tell you right then, based on the number of exchanges you're planning to do, whether the capacity is available or not. And if not, then you'll have to have a conversation about when you can exchange. Very important in this case for the dealer to communicate that information on availability and all the other details of the exchange back to the investor. As Jamie, I think, mentioned, you can book for settlement in the current or following month during the dealer path. So, today's an interesting example since we're at the first of the month, right? So if you go in today and book an exchange in the dealer path, you could settle on any available settlement date in November or December, because since we're at the 1st of November, you've got almost a full 2-month window to book. We mentioned, obviously, that the trade entry will be done by the dealers in Freddie Mac's Dealer Direct portal. Settlement, again, normal course of business is a minimum of T+1 as long as you book by noon. During transition, that will be T+2, but hopefully if things go smoothly, we can offer that T+1 option. Once you do get to settlement day, all of the settlement activity actually takes place during the course of the same calendar day. So you'll need to deliver your 45-day securities in by noon. We'll auto match. Hopefully everything will work smoothly. And as soon as it auto matches, that 55-day security will come right back to the dealer, who can then settle up with the investor. The dealer will receive a cash wire at the end of the day for the float compensation, but they will have already netted that out of the buyback price to the investor. So that's really just kind of Freddie Mac settling up with the dealer at the end of the day. Also important to note that Freddie Mac will hold the 45-day security in trust for the delivering dealer until the exchange can be completed, or if there's a problem, until we can decay the 45-day security back to you. Okay. And again, just to reemphasize the initial setup on slide 15, for the dealer facilitated path, we do have a list that we're beginning to populate on our exchange website of the dealers who've signed up to facilitate the exchange. As more and more dealers complete that sign-up process, we'll add them to the list. So keep checking. If there's a dealer that you would like to use and you don't see them on the list, please reach out to your dealer and ask them if they're interested in planning to facilitate exchange. And if they haven't thought about it, they can certainly contact us. We can talk to them about it. Again, if you're working with a dealer that you haven't worked with before, make sure you leave time to establish that dealer as a counterparty. Obviously, we can't speak to what those dealers' processes may be, so you'll really need to communicate with the dealer to understand those. Also, even if you have worked with your dealer for years, please contact them and talk to them about this exchange, because they may have other requirements to get set up for it. They may have additional constraints in terms of capacity or booking deadlines, and so we want to make sure that you're all ready for those. All right, and slide 16, again, the blackout dates, just reiterating those blackout dates, they're the same as the ones that Jamie had mentioned earlier. You're going to need to provide your dealer with the list of the QSIPs par pool number and desired settlement date that you wish. I will mention if you're exchanging via the dealer facilitated path, the float compensation calculator tool that was mentioned earlier, one of the nice things about that tool, if you go out and see what your float comp's going to be, you'll actually be able to get the results and then download a spreadsheet of the information that just so happens to be the same format that the dealer is going to need to upload into Dealer Direct to perform the exchange. So just kind of an operational efficiency tip. Go out, check your float comp, download that spreadsheet, and then you can send that right to the dealer, and that just makes things a little bit easier. Again, the 45-day collateral has to be delivered to Freddie Mac by noon Eastern time in order to ensure that we can settle that day. And then as soon as everything matches, again, you'll get your the dealer will get the 55-day right back. And just reiterating the holding in trust and the fact that we would, if you're an investor, we would expect that the dealers are going to be netting the float compensation out of that buyback price for you. Okay. So let me turn it back over to Jamie to talk a little bit more about the direct Freddie Mac path.
Thanks, MR. All right, so just to quickly run down these features again, as we said, your counterparty in this transaction is going to be Freddie Mac, so you need to get us set up on your side. Your delivery is free of payment. Again, you'll be working with your custodian, and the custodian will be helping to get the securities to us on your behalf, and also taking the float compensation and securities wire back from us, again, on your behalf. You can exchange whole or partial CUSIPs, same transaction capacity. You will be able to see the capacity on TradeWeb prior to confirming your exchange transaction. So again, that's something to think about when you're planning. Booking is only going to be available for the current month via this path. You will be able to enter your exchanges directly into TradeWeb through their interface or through your OMS system, and TradeWeb will get to that in just a moment. And they'll support a solicited or unsolicited workflow. The same settlement rules apply. The only difference here is the float compensation will be paid to you via separate cash wire. All right, so I am going to turn it over to Brian Devers from TradeWeb to walk through some of the specifics of the TradeWeb path. Brian?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, everybody, for dialing in. So next couple of slides, the next few minutes, I'm just going to start off by going through, if you've decided to go through the TradeWeb path and direct to Freddie, let's talk a little bit about what the setup requirements are and what you should expect. First of all, the process should take roughly around 2 to 3 weeks. Once you alert your TradeWeb salesperson, or if you're, and by the way, as I'll point out later on, this option is available to non-TradeWeb customers or customers not currently using TradeWeb. The first process in the initial setup is KYC. TradeWeb, once we will be collecting certain documents to perform our KYC process on the entity level for an investor. Once we determine our assessment, we are going to hand those over to Freddie Mac, who will make the final determination as to whether or not you can go through the TradeWeb Direct to Freddie path. If you cannot, then you will be required to go through a dealer. Each investor is going to have to satisfy certain tax requirements. And again, if you're unable to do that, then you're going to have to go through a dealer. So we will be collecting W-8s and W-9s for non-U.S. investors. And again, these forms are going to be submitted for your organization and not your end accounts. For non-U.S. asset managers exchanging on behalf of a client, you have to be designated as a qualified intermediary, another important point. And as I said, this path is going to be available to anyone that wants to do it, provided you satisfy the KYC requirements, tax requirements. Next, once we've gotten that information back and we've gotten green light from Freddie Mac, We're going to go through the setup process on our side. Tradeweb will be treating this as a separate product group. So we will go and we will create IDs for those that do not have it. We will require a form that will be electronically signed that you're going to be interacting with Freddie as a counterparty on this exchange. And then ultimately, after all these pieces are done, Freddie Mac will enable you as they do, as a dealer would today on our platform, so that you can interact with them and they show up on your screens. Lastly, you're also acknowledging when you enter an agreement with Freddie Mac, you're going to make representations and warranties. You're going to acknowledge that you've received the exchange offering circular, and then, of course, accept the exchange offer. Last two pieces of information for that Freddie would like to collect as they onboard people is some point of contact, just in case there's hopefully none, but in case there are any settlement issues. And then another thing is that we are going to be, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but Tradeweb will be obtaining wiring instructions from Alert so that to facilitate the wire instructions and security instructions to Freddie and to the investor, who will then direct those on to the custodian. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Couple more just repeating. I know MR as well as Jamie had mentioned some of these things, but some housekeeping things in terms of thinking about when it's time to exchange. We will accept both an unsolicited path as well as a solicited path coming from an OMS. I'll go into those in more detail on the next slide. Exchanges going through this path are limited to the current month. So again, perfect being the first day of the month. There are blackout dates for the first four business days, meaning you will not be able to access or set up the screens until the 5th business day. So blackout booking dates are the first 4 business days of the month and the last business day of the month. Settlement blackout dates, same as has been repeated before, first 5 business days of the month, Class A and B settlement, and the end of month -2, which is the remit collateral delivery date. Just generally speaking, we will be providing specs to anybody's technology departments that need them in the very near future. But generally speaking, what you're going to be required to provide when you interact with Tradeweb is the 45-day QSIP, the par amount that you're looking to exchange, the dollar price or your book price, and the settlement date that you're looking to exchange. We are going to provide the float compensation. We'll be interacting with Freddie Mac's pricing grid, and we will display to you, like we do in almost any trade that you do on Tradeweb, we will show you prior to making the decision to send a request out. We'll show you what your float comp will be for each QSIP. You will have a final last look before confirming or booking the reservation. And then a couple of settlement details. Once Freddie receives the 45-day QSIP during settlement, they will return the 55-day immediately once they validate that. Freddie Mac's going to hold the 45-day security in trust until the exchange is completed. And then again, the separate wire will be sent to the investor for the float compensation. So next slide, we'll just go through a little bit more detail about the various paths. We throw some terms out there. We're going to leverage current infrastructure, which is our list trading tool. There may be front office people here that are used to that, but essentially our list trading tool is a spreadsheet within our Tradeweb viewer. Some of the terms that we've thrown out are an unsolicited and a solicited view. So I just want to clarify what we mean by that. An unsolicited transaction to us simply means that we are not taking orders in from an OMS. It's a manual entry. So going down under the solicited header there, that means from our user interface, we will allow you to type in QSIPs, par amounts, and prices, or you can cut and paste from Excel, which is likely the way most people will do it. Even if you do it manually, but you have post-trade connectivity to us, we will continue to support that. So meaning if you do a manual order entry, do the exchange, and accept the exchange, we will kick off either a flat file or our fixed post-trade feed so that you can book it into your systems. And again, I think this has been key, and the whole reason why we are working with Freddie Mac is that we want this to look as seamless and feel like a trade like you do today on TradeWeb, to be as seamless and intuitive as possible. Now, to the right, we have solicited trades. That means orders being submitted to us from an OMS like Bloomberg Palms, Odessa, Charles River, Minerva, et cetera. Those orders will look very much like they do today. You will submit to us, there's a couple of ways. You can submit to us just the 45-day and receive back both a confirmation that you sold a 45-day and you're buying a 55-day. You can also send it to us in a list format. You can also send it to us in a paired format, or what's called an AB message, where you send us the 45 and 55-day tied together. In all of these paths, we will support both pre and post-trade allocations. So depending on your flow, you can submit the request to Freddie, get determined capacity, reserve the capacity, and then send the allocations later, obviously prior to settlement, or you can do it up front, where you, before even contacting Freddie through TradeWeb for the exchange and determining capacity, you can do the allocations. Finally, under the exchange in and out, or under solicited, we have the exchange in and out flow. Some OMSs will be treating this by having a separate message type. Again, this will look regardless of whether you want to do the exchange in or exchange out, if your OMS supports it. From the end user's point of view on TradeWeb, it's going to look like a trade or a buy or sell. And from a messaging and from a processing point of view, it'll look like a buy and sell. Now, the exchange in, exchange out is always a pre-allocated message type. What's happening in this case is the investor is sending individual lot allocations to TradeWeb via a fixed message, and TradeWeb will aggregate them up and create allocations on our system. And then from that point on, it looks like the standard flow, where we send the allocations to Freddie, and then if the exchange is agreed upon, we then release those to Freddie for processing downstream. So the list trading screen, again, kind of hit on all these points. We're going to go through the screen in a second, but it's going to look very much like any other trade on the system. And if there are bespoke solutions that are required, and what I mean by that is we are in the process right now. I hope to have within the next week or two specifications around which fields in our post-trade message will include things like the float compensation, the exchange ID that was mentioned by MR earlier, other additional fields that may be required so that an investor and their systems can properly handle this and communicate with their downstream systems. So we will be publishing what we plan to offer, and then we anticipate some feedback if there is additional fields that will be required that we need to put in a fixed message or in it as part of even a download from our exchange screen. We'll be open to consider those things so that we can make your lives as easy as possible on this path. So the next couple of slides I'll just buzz through, and they are, I think, some screenshots of what we plan to give you a sense and a feel of how this will look. So once a user is authorized, they will go on to TradeWeb. They will click a button that says Freddie Exchange. It will launch a ticket that would initially be empty. You will select in the upper left-hand corner, or if you provide it via message, the settlement date that you're looking for. You will provide in the first column is the 45-day CUSIPs, your original face, and then that middle column there in white is the book price that you know your position. To the right, I'm showing sample numbers, but we would go out and query the Freddie Mac pricing grid, and we would return for you what the float comp will be. Again, it should be identical after you click the next button. So When you click the Submit Exchange in the lower left-hand corner, we would transition to our negotiation screen, so that you can go to that next screen. And again, like a normal trade, we will summarize things in the upper left-hand corner, the number of line items in this list, total original face and current face, those should be identical. We will tell you what your total float comp is across all items in the list. To the far right corner, you see a countdown timer. You will, at this point, we've already asked Freddie to hold capacity for the 36 items on this list. They're doing so, and they're going to hold it there for 5 minutes so that someone else doesn't take your space. So you'll be able to review this if you need to export it or whatever. And then you have two options. You can either cancel it and do it another time, or if you click confirm, we then start sending the post-trade services. And depending on your flow, if you've pre-allocated at this point, we would send the allocations directly to Freddie. Those allocations would include all the wiring instructions and settlement instructions that we obtain from Alert and Freddie and your custody. And we would send that, by the way, to both Freddie as well as the investor. At that point, their respective systems would take care of the wiring and settlement instructions and move all of the securities back and forth. If you were post-allocating, TradeWeb will be going into Oasis on behalf of Freddie and pulling down your allocations. And then again, same thing as I just described, we would deliver those allocations to Freddie along with the instructions, and the post-trade processes and settlement instructions would be sent. The last screen is just another example of the way we're implementing this in our system and integrating it. We will have all of our normal business as usual screens and functionalities will work. So this is an example of a post-trade detail where we're kind of showing the selling of a 45-day, its linked mirror security, the amounts, et cetera. And we will include various reporting capabilities. You'll see these things in your blotter and all of the other related post-trade screens. We keep everything on our system indefinitely, so you can always go back and retrieve any reports that you, on exchanges that you performed via this path at any time. I think that's enough of my time. Again, just the last thing, and I know we'll plug this at the end. If you need to contact anyone at TradeWeb, you can contact your sales rep or just hit umbs@tradeweb.com, and we man that all the time, and someone will get back to you as quickly as possible. I think that goes back to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Brian. Listen, just in the interest of time today, we do want to allow for a few more questions. So we do have some detail on accounting and tax treatments, and the deck will be posted. So look for that information, and we're happy to answer questions about that. But let's just open it up for questions now. So any questions?
Hello. Hi.
Hi, this is Elizabeth. And my question is I'm curious about the potential problems. You mentioned that within the 40 days holding period, you mentioned that some of the securities might be rejected for X reason. What are the potential problems that might arise?
Why would we DK the transaction?
Yeah.
Oh, so, I mean, we would DK the transaction, for example, if the par amount or the CUSIP did not match what was in the reservation, if you sent in the wrong security and it was not eligible for exchange or didn't match, those are the kind of reasons we would DK.
Yeah, and I think, the main reason for any kind of a settlement fail is if the collateral cannot be delivered to us. And so I think that's what we're saying, there's a preparation session that you need to think about ahead of time to make sure you know where your collateral is so that you don't actually fail in your settlement.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. There was someone else who had a question at the same time.
Yes. Is mirror CUSIP file that's now available?
we're expecting to get that through Bloomberg so that we can set up those securities in our database automatically. But Bloomberg is saying that they won't have that ready until January. Is that consistent with what your expectation is of data vendors?
Say that again. What do you mean, the QSIP?
The new update QSIPs, the mirrors.
The mirrors.
Yeah, mirrors are already up
On
on Bloomberg. You could actually look it up right now.
Yeah, but they're not making it available through their back office data license system until January.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
All
So it
right.
makes it, you know, we don't want to set them
yeah.
up by hand by going to a Bloomberg terminal and looking them up.
Right. And no, we understand. We did not make a specific requirement of the data vendors. We did make them available as soon as possible, and many of them have started pulling the data in. But I know Bloomberg is also going through a bit of a system switch, so that might be part of the reason why they're not offering it through their download service. But we can follow up with Bloomberg as well.
yeah.
That would be helpful.
Okay, we can do that.
And a second question is, the SWIFT file for the trade web route for a custodian is helpful because that would offer a consistent communication protocol. But in the cases where you use a dealer and the custodian needs to know that this is an exchange, if the custodian is also the accounting agent, what's the method for making them aware that this is not an actual trade, but it's an exchange? Is that something that's been considered and agreed?
So that SWIFT message recommendation, from that perspective, it's almost more important on the dealer facilitated path, because if you're delivering, or if you're instructing your custodian to deliver to a dealer, you know, if you're delivering directly to Freddie, at least they know if it's going to our dedicated accounts, they know it's an exchange. If you're delivering just to the dealer's regular account, there's no way they're going to know. So that SWIFT message tagging is incredibly important, especially on the dealer path.
Yeah, I think it's mainly for the dealer path.
Although even the direct path, they need the ID so they can link it to the cache. But yeah, it's very important.
And
We got one question on the chat. It says, if investors choose the dealer path, will the buy-sell be disclosed on Trace?
Not trace reportable.
It's not trace reportable. There's some information on our website and also on the FINRA website. But if, as long as the price for the transaction just reflects the security and the float compensation, it will not be trace reportable. All right, I think we have time for one more question.
Question on the TradeWeb solicited workflow.
Mm-hmm.
So under the OMS standard fix workflow, OMS examples include Bloomberg AIM, CRD, and Fidessa. Does Aladdin not have that option?
No, Aladdin is also part of that group.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a little confusing because the next one says example Aladdin, so it almost seems like Aladdin only has one option, but as long as it has both options, that's good.
Yeah, Aladdin should support both options. Aladdin was looking at the exchange in, exchange out, and the reason was where that message was going to originate from, or it had the ability to interact with certain downstream systems, namely, I think, some accounting systems that wire up to it and corporate actions, I believe. But we should also, we're working with Aladdin, and if you want to reach out to me, Brian Devers at tradeweb.com, or just send it to that UMBS, we can have a follow-up, and if we need to get some Aladdin folks on, we can do that too.
Okay, yeah, we were going to check in with our service rep and kind of just get the whole workflow down.
Cool.
All right, everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sorry we're out of time, but we are happy to take your questions through the Freddie Mac mailbox, single_security@freddiemac.com, or to TradeWeb at UMBS@tradeweb.com. On the last page of the deck, there are links to a number of resources. And as I said at the top of the hour, we are going to be posting this deck and a recording of the session. So So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.